So I'm standing on my front porch in the middle of a winter blackout, lighting a fire pit with a blowtorch, when Karen storms over, yelling, "Open flames are prohibited." That'd be annoying enough. But then she smirks and says, "Maybe you should have paid your HOA fees like the rest of us." Thing is, I don't owe a dime, and she doesn't know I'm the guy who signs off on the HOA's electrical permit. Now let me back up a second, because to understand how absurd this moment was, you need to know what kind of circus I'd landed in. 3 months earlier, I inherited this house from my Uncle Dave. It was paid off, built just outside the formal HOA boundary line, and had its own legacy grid tie-in that didn't fall under HOA jurisdiction. And before you ask, yes, that detail matters later. A lot. But back then, all I knew was I'd finally escaped apartment living and moved into what I thought would be a peaceful slice of the suburbs. I was wrong. The neighborhood was quiet, sure, but not peaceful. You know those gated communities where every yard looks the same, and everyone drives at least one crossover with their kid's soccer team sticker on the back? Yeah, that kind of place. And at the helm of it all, Karen, 50-some, power-walking addict, wears pearls to rake leaves, HOA president for 8 years running, and proud of it. She welcomed me with a clipboard, a printed "Welcome to the Neighborhood" packet, and a violation notice for parking my truck on my own gravel driveway. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I laughed. She didn't. Her eyes scanned my face like she was trying to decide whether I'd be a problem or just another spineless pushover. I told her I didn't join the HOA and had no intention of doing so. She stiffened like I'd slapped her with a fish. "All properties on this block fall under HOA expectations," she chirped, waving some dusty map she printed from God knows where. I pointed to my deed. No HOA attachment, no agreement, no jurisdiction. She left without another word, but not before letting her eyes flick to the firewood stacked neatly beside my porch like it personally offended her. Then came the letters. Handwritten notes in my mailbox, and signed, but unmistakably Karen. "Please consider painting your shutters neutral beige for community cohesion. Friendly reminder, gravel driveways are a fire hazard. Reconsideration of your non-HOA status may benefit all parties involved." She was clearly baiting me. I didn't bite. I just documented every single one. See, what Karen didn't know, and never bothered to find out, is that I work in power grid inspection. I don't just know how the infrastructure works. I approve, audit, and greenlight grid extensions, power permits, transformer upgrades, and substation licensing across 3 counties. That includes residential developments like this one, including their HOA, including Karen's precious little empire. Still, I didn't escalate. I wanted to be neighborly, or at least boring enough that she got bored. That was naive of me, because Karen wasn't looking for compliance. She was looking for submission. And when the weather reports started rolling in, forecasting a major winter storm, I should have known she'd see it as an opportunity. I prepped quietly. My place runs partially off-grid anyway, thanks to the solar array my uncle installed before it was trendy. I had battery banks, a propane generator, and emergency radiant heaters. Everything code compliant. Everything safe. Everything fully legal. The HOA, however, had its own blackout protocol. No wood-burning fires. No visible gas tanks. No personal generators unless approved and screened from street view. I ignored it, because again, I wasn't part of it. But Karen didn't see it that way. The storm hit hard. Power went out across. Hello friends, if you're new here, then don't forget to hit subscribe button. And if you like, then hit the like button also, and don't forget to tell me in the comments where you from watching this video. The neighborhood went dark just after 7 p.m. I was outside, bundled in 2 jackets, relighting my fire pit with a blowtorch when Karen marched up the driveway like she was leading a military patrol. She was fuming. Her own house was dark, cold, and miserable, and mine lit up like a magazine ad. She started yelling about fire codes, community rules, and endangering others. I told her, politely but firmly, to leave my property. That's when she dropped the smirk and said I'd regret not paying my fair share, which, for someone supposedly freezing in her own house, was a bold thing to say. I didn't think much of it that night. I went back inside, made coffee with my backup power, and settled in with a book. But when I woke up the next morning, everything was off. No power. No backup. Nothing. I walked out to check my transformer line. That's when I noticed it. My main cable had been disconnected from the HOA shared transformer. The one they had installed across the property edge years before I moved in. It wasn't just unplugged. It was cleanly cut, physically severed. My first reaction was confusion, then anger, then curiosity. I had installed a discreet security cam near the transformer box months ago, just to keep tabs on wildlife chewing wires. What I saw made me choke on my coffee. One of the HOA board members, headlamp on, bolt cutters in hand, snipping my line just before midnight. He even looked into the camera and smiled. I called the sheriff. They said it was a civil matter. I called the HOA. They said it was a miscommunication. I called my attorney. He said, keep every record. They just made this personal. But I didn't panic. I didn't yell. I didn't even call the guy back. I just started drafting the inspection order. And this is where it gets good, because Karen doesn't know the permits she'll need to restore power to the neighborhood next week. They all go through my office. And suddenly, I have some serious concerns about the condition of her electrical infrastructure. I'll admit, part of me wanted to just write it off. Move on. Forget it ever happened. But then, the very next morning, as I was outside inspecting the damage, Karen had the audacity to walk past, sipping coffee like she was royalty, and said, maybe this will teach you how we do things around here. That's when I smiled, because I realized she really had no idea who I was. No clue she had just sabotaged the one person who could, and now would, audit every single inch of her HOA's electrical system. No idea that I'd been waiting for someone exactly like her to pull something like this. And no idea that I'd already started the paperwork. And right as she turned to go back to her house, smug as ever, a bright orange utility truck rolled into the neighborhood. She paused, watched it, didn't recognize the logo. And as it pulled up in front of her HOA office, she walked a little slower, a little more cautious. What she didn't see, what she couldn't have seen, was the state inspection notice on the windshield. Signed by me. Dated that morning. Labeled, Mandatory Compliance Review, Power Infrastructure. Let's just say, she's about to find out what happens when you unplug the wrong guy. By the time the utility truck rolled away and Karen realized something wasn't right, the gears had already been set in motion. What she assumed was a bluff turned into a full-blown state-level inspection. And her precious little HOA shed, complete with a cracked breaker panel and a questionable makeshift wiring job, was about to become the center of a very uncomfortable spotlight. But let's rewind just a bit. Because the day after I filed the compliance review was when things really started unraveling. For her, not me. I started with the paperwork. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just dry, bureaucratic forms filed through the proper channels. I noted every potential issue I'd already witnessed. Exposed wiring on the HOA pool lights, transformer pads without certified grounding, and illegal generator hookups. For the clubhouse HVAC system. Then I submitted a routine field request. In my world, that's like ringing the bell and watching the hounds come running. The state takes infrastructure safety seriously, especially when it's tied to residential communities built pre-2000 with no documented permit renewals. And wouldn't you know it, Karen's beloved neighborhood was one of those. Just old enough to be vulnerable. Just smug enough to think no one would notice. 2 days later, she knocked on my door. Not with a warning this time, with cookies. Store-bought, overwrapped, and suspiciously lukewarm. Her smile was stretched too wide. Her voice sugar-sweet, like she was channeling step-forward energy but didn't know how to calibrate it. "Hi, neighbor," she sang. "Just thought we got off on the wrong foot." I told her I wasn't hungry. She didn't budge, stood on my porch like a vacuum salesman waiting for the door to shut. Then she tried the sympathy angle. Told me how hard it was to be a volunteer president. How people in the neighborhood didn't appreciate all the work she did. How she'd be so grateful if I took it easy on the inspection team when they came around. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You know what would have made this a lot easier?" She blinked. I finished, not cutting my power during a blackout. The smile faded. The cookies stayed. And so did the awkward silence. 3 days later, the first inspection crew arrived. Karen wasn't notified in advance. That's part of the charm of a surprise compliance review. You get to see things as they actually are, not how someone wants them to appear. The crew took photos, made notes, walked the perimeter of the clubhouse, took one look at the rat's nest of wires duct taped along the back fence, and winced like they'd seen a crime scene. I didn't have to say a word. The inspection chief, a guy named Ramirez I'd worked with for years, waved to me on his way out and said, "You weren't kidding." That evening, The HOA sent out an emergency newsletter. Karen's tone had changed drastically. Gone were the passive-aggressive citations and cheery formatting. This one was all caps panic. All residents must avoid commenting to state inspectors. Do not allow access to private homes without HOA permission. HOA board is handling the situation professionally. Translation: the house of cards was swaying. Now, I hadn't told anyone who I was. I didn't flaunt my badge. I didn't walk around with a clipboard and a flashlight pretending to be the hero. I just kept to myself, mowed my lawn, waved politely to the people who didn't glare at me, and let Karen keep spinning her wheels. Because at this point, every time she tried to gain control, she only made it worse. Like when she tried to install a temporary power bypass on the pool lights to keep the clubhouse available for warming. That would have been thoughtful if she hadn't hired a high schooler with zero licensing to do the job. Or the time she hosted an emergency HOA board meeting using a gas generator inside the enclosed maintenance shed, which turned into a minor carbon monoxide incident. It didn't hurt anyone, but the fire marshal was less than thrilled. The HOA board, once loyal to a fault, began turning on her. Quietly, I could see it in their body language. Nervous glances, whispered chats in the driveway. A few started stopping by my place under the pretense of asking for advice on home upgrades. I offered coffee. They brought their own mugs and excuses. But what they really wanted was information. What was coming next? The answer: a citywide notice of code violations issued to the HOA itself. It was the equivalent of a public slap across the face. Their entire infrastructure had failed inspection. Non-compliance in 5 categories. Fines pending. Permits suspended. And until the corrections were made, the HOA couldn't legally authorize power reconnections, facility access, or maintenance work on any shared systems. In short, they were powerless. And then came the best part. Because when an HOA loses permit authority, the responsibility for emergency access and compliance defaults to the nearest municipal entity, and wouldn't you know it, my address was technically unincorporated, but my lot sat on a grandfathered easement line from the county's utility district. That meant the nearest permitted, functioning grid hookup belonged to me. Karen figured it out the next morning. I was outside adjusting the solar battery inverter when she stormed up the sidewalk in full fury, wrapped in a red wool shawl like some angry Christmas ghost. She demanded answers, asked if I had something to do with this. I told her I'd been staying warm and fully powered thanks to my legally installed off-grid setup, and that I hoped her inspections went well. She accused me of sabotaging the HOA, said I was undermining her leadership. I told her flatly, "You did that all by yourself." Her face went red, and she stormed off without another word. Later that night, the neighborhood group chat, a poorly moderated mess I had never participated in, suddenly lit up. Someone had leaked the inspection result photos too. Pictures of the exposed wires, the cracked outlets, the non-compliant generator install. Karen tried to shut it down, citing privacy and legal threat, but it was too late. Screenshots were already being shared. Memes followed. One had Karen photoshopped onto a power line, screaming. Another dubbed her the Queen of Darkness. I should have felt bad. I didn't. The last message I saw before logging off for the night was from a board member named Shelley. So wait. Who exactly filed this report? The comments exploded beneath it. Speculation, theories, and then someone posted a picture. A screenshot from my security cam, the one that caught the board member cutting my power. My name was written in the corner, clear as day. And that's when the question stopped. Because suddenly the dots connected. And just as I turned off my phone and headed to bed, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a certified letter on the porch. No one in sight. The HOA letterhead was shaking slightly in the wind. I picked it up, scanned it, and laughed out loud, because the HOA was requesting an emergency appeal to reinstate their permit. And they were asking for my signature. I didn't sign it. Not immediately, anyway. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and stared at that letter like it had personally insulted my ancestors. The HOA was desperate now. They'd realized they couldn't override the city, couldn't sweet-talk their way around the inspection board, and couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when half the neighborhood was running on extension cords and propane tanks. So they turned to me, the very guy they tried to freeze out, frame as a troublemaker, and humiliate publicly, for a lifeline. It would have been funny if it weren't so pitiful. What they wanted was simple. I had the authority to recommend a provisional reinstatement of their suspended permits, pending further correction. Basically, it would let them restore minimal functionality to the shared grid while they worked on fixing everything else. It was a common step in bureaucratic infrastructure repair, but there was a catch. They needed someone in good standing, with clean history, and no personal conflict of interest. I was technically allowed to approve it, but ethically debatable, legally borderline, politically explosive. Karen must have known that, which is probably why the next morning she showed up again. No clipboard this time. No fake smile. Just her, standing at the edge of my driveway in a ridiculous fur coat and boots that had never touched mud. She looked tired, not in the way you do after a long night, but in the way that sets in when your fake little empire is crashing around you, and you realize everyone you ruled over with smug superiority suddenly wants your resignation. She didn't ask to come up. She just stood there and said, "I'm sorry." I almost dropped my coffee. It was short, mumbled, barely audible, but it was real. For a second, I didn't know what to say. Then she followed it up with, "You have to understand, I didn't know who you were." That snapped me right back to my senses. I stood up, walked down the steps, and said, "And if I were just some regular guy without credentials, you'd still have cut my power," and laughed about it. Her silence was answer enough. I told her I wasn't signing anything, not yet, that I had questions, that I wanted transparency, and most importantly, I wanted every single resident to know exactly what their dues had been paying for and what corners had been cut to keep her illusion going. She didn't argue. She just nodded and walked away, the fur on her coat swaying like a parody of authority fading into the background. I didn't see her again for 3 days. In the meantime, the neighborhood began unraveling in the most delightful ways. With the inspection reports leaked and the HOA newsletter now reduced to awkward damage control statements, people started coming out of the woodwork. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to were knocking on my door asking about solar panels, legal options, and how to petition for a board vote. A man named Greg showed me a file he'd kept for 4 years, documenting arbitrary fines Karen had issued with no paper trail. A woman named Dana revealed she'd been threatened with foreclosure for a fence she installed with HOA approval. But mysteriously, the approval document had gone missing. The more they shared, the more it became clear that Karen hadn't just overstepped. She'd built her own little monarchy using fear, confusion, and technicalities. And now that fear was gone, what replaced it was anger. It wasn't long before someone started circulating a petition. The goal was simple: force a full emergency board re-election. In most HOAs, that's nearly impossible. But because of the suspension, the HOA's legal authority to block or stall such a petition had vanished. And people knew it. Karen must have felt it closing in, because the next time I saw her, she wasn't wearing fur or heels. She looked normal, exhausted, but normal. She handed me a folder. An actual, honest folder. Not some passive-aggressive HOA packet. Inside were the revised repair plans, contractor permits, fire code documentation, and receipts for upgraded equipment. It was clean, legit, and frankly impressive, but it still wasn't enough. "Looks good," I told her, flipping through it. "Why didn't you just do this in the first place?" She looked at the ground and muttered something about not thinking it would go this far. I said, "It didn't. You dragged it this far." Then I told her the truth. "If you want me to sign this, I need one more thing. You resign. Publicly. Today." She looked like I'd slapped her. "That's not how it works," she said weakly. I shrugged. "It's how it works now." She left in silence. Hours later, an email blast went out. It was the first one she didn't write in her signature voice. No bold fonts. No underlined rules. Just a resignation notice, effective immediately. Karen was stepping down, and you could practically hear the champagne corks popping across the street. I still didn't sign it right away. I waited. Watched. Let the new interim board organize themselves. They weren't perfect. No board ever is. But they were transparent, civil, and most importantly, not power-tripping lunatics. The repairs began the next day. Contractors showed up. Real ones, with licenses and paperwork and helmets that weren't just for show. I walked the sites, checked their work, and gave the green light for provisional restoration. And when the power finally clicked back on for the rest of the neighborhood, no one cheered louder than the same people who once looked at me like I was the villain. But just when things started to settle, the next twist came out of nowhere. One of the interim board members, a guy named Ree, who used to avoid eye contact like I was contagious, showed up at my door with a cardboard box. Said he'd found it in the back of the HOA office, behind some insulation panels. Inside were folders, dozens of them. Paperwork Karen had kept hidden. Financial reports that didn't match the official book. Fee collections with no destination receipt. Phantom contractor payments that never turned into real work. One file even showed a backyard security camera fund Karen had set up with HOA money. Only it had been rerouted to a private storage unit. Ree asked me what it all meant. I didn't answer. I just stared at the papers, at the signatures, at the dates. Then I picked up my phone. Not to call the city. Not to call the board. I called someone else entirely, the state's fraud division. Because apparently, Karen hadn't just been a nightmare neighbor. She might have been embezzling. And if that were true, this little revenge story was about to become a full-blown criminal investigation. The moment I handed over that box to the fraud division, everything shifted. What started as a petty revenge arc over a sabotage power line had just crossed into legal thriller territory. I wasn't gloating, not exactly, but I'd be lying if I said watching the smug queen of citations get tangled in her own paperwork web didn't feel like poetic justice. The investigation kicked off quietly at first. An agent from the state's Office of Community Oversight met with me in a diner 2 towns over, neutral ground, no names used. Standard procedure. I gave them the box, my notes, the digital backups, and every HOA newsletter I'd archived like some obsessive hoarder. They didn't say much, just nodded and took everything. But I could tell from the way their eyes kept flicking to the copies of financial logs that this wasn't the first time someone like Karen had tried to play Empress with other people's dues. A week later, subpoenas started dropping. Ree told me over the phone, his voice a mix of nervous and exhilarated, that state auditors had shown up at the HOA office with 3 cruisers and a box truck. They confiscated everything. Computers, filing cabinets, even a weird little safe that Karen had bolted under the reception desk. According to Ree, she tried to play it cool, until they asked for the access code. Then she cracked, cried, said it was all a misunderstanding. But by then, it was far too late. The thing about Karens is they rarely know when the game's up. They always think there's one more rule they can twist, one more technicality they can shout into submission. But not this time. The neighborhood was buzzing. Not just in the nosy, gossip-thirsty way suburbs usually buzz, but in that stunned, jaw-dropped, slowly realizing what she'd done kind of way. Turns out, Karen hadn't just been issuing fake violations or misusing her power. She'd been outright stealing. HOA funds that were supposed to go toward community improvements had been diverted into her personal account under the guise of consulting fees. Contractors she claimed to have hired didn't exist. Repairs that residents were billed for were never made. And worst of all, there were several late payment threats sent to elderly residents that were never actually filed with the board, just pocketed. One of the victims, a sweet retired woman named Linda, who baked the world's driest banana bread but had a heart of gold, had been paying double dues for nearly 2 years. Karen told her it was because her backyard shed violated a secondary shadow line easement. That's not a real thing. I checked. It doesn't exist in any building code anywhere. Karen just made it up. And Linda, bless her trusting heart, believed her. I helped Linda file a formal restitution claim. So did 8 other residents. By the time the news hit local media, the headline practically wrote itself. HOA president investigated for fraud after power dispute with grid inspector. Yeah, that last part, that was me. I wasn't named directly, but let's just say I got more than a few thumbs up from neighbors who used to avoid eye contact. Even Greg, the guy who once reported me for having aggressively tinted porch lights, dropped off a 6-pack and said, "You were right about her." I told him I'd keep the beer if he dropped the tint complaint. He laughed. We shook hands. Civilization, as it turns out, is possible even in HOA territory. Karen was formally charged with embezzlement, falsifying financial documents, and obstruction of a state audit. She was arrested quietly, no fanfare, no cameras. Just a gray sedan and a pair of plainclothes agents who walked her out of her house like she was being escorted to a dentist appointment. But I watched from my window, coffee in hand. And I'm not ashamed to admit, I smiled just a little. The interim board held a vote 2 weeks later, not just for new leadership, but to dissolve the HOA entirely. It passed by a landslide, 89%. That's almost unheard of. Most people are too scared of what happens when an HOA collapses. But after Karen, the neighborhood was ready to risk it. Ready to live without daily threats over lawn length and mailbox alignment. Ready to be actual neighbors, not subjects in some beige kingdom ruled by a woman with too much free time and an overfed printer. I was asked to be part of the transitional committee. I declined, not because I didn't care. I just didn't want to turn into the next Karen. Power is a funny thing. People think revenge is about getting even, but it's not. Real revenge is watching someone dig their own hole while you sit comfortably with a bag of popcorn, knowing you never had to lift a shovel. My satisfaction came not from destroying Karen, but from surviving her, outsmarting her, outlasting her, and making sure no one like her ever got that much unchecked control again. The final chapter came on a warm spring morning. I was outside reinstalling one of my solar inverters when a moving truck pulled up across the street. Karen's house. Her daughter, a surprisingly normal human being, was helping load up boxes. I didn't ask where she was going. Didn't care. All I knew was that her reign was over, and the neighborhood she tried to micromanage into submission had reclaimed its voice. No more fake citations. No more power sabotage. No more HOA newsletters written like military dispatches. Later that afternoon, Ree stopped by. Said they were holding a small barbecue to celebrate the dissolution. Wanted to know if I'd come. I told him I'd think about it. He laughed and said, "We'll save you a plate." As I watched him walk back down the street, waving to neighbors who were now laughing and chatting in front yards instead of hiding behind blinds, I realized something I hadn't expected. Peace had returned. Not perfection, not utopia, but something better, something earned. That night, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, I lit the fire pit again. This time, no blowtorch, no confrontation. Just flame, warmth, and a good chair. And as the soft glow filled the yard, I thought back to that moment during the blackout. Karen yelling about rules, smirking like she held all the cards. She didn't know then that I was the guy who signed her grid permit, that I was the fuse she was yanking without even checking the box. And she certainly didn't know that the biggest power she'd ever cut off was her own.